This month, whether we like it or not, we turn our attention to the Marcos family. September is associated with them. September 11 is the dictator's birthday, and September 21 is the fictional start of the very real dictatorship. And this year, under a second President Ferdinand Marcos, the country marks Marcos's 105th birthday and the 50th anniversary of the imposition of martial law. We will be looking into different aspects of Marcosian politics throughout the month. Tonight, we begin by asking, what was Marcos like before martial law? Good evening. I'm John Nery, and you are in the public square. Ferdinand Marcos started his political career in 1949. He was a congressman for about 10 years and then a senator for 6. But he is better known in history for his 20 years as president. In his last 14 years in power, he was the pharaoh at the top of a political pyramid called constitutional authoritarianism. But what was he like when he was still one of hundreds of congressmen or one of dozens of senators? Much of the research and the myth-making about him deals with his presidency. Can we discern in the early stages of his political career any signs of the calamity that was to come? Our guests tonight belong to different generations, but they have both been watchdogging the Marcoses for many years. I am delighted to welcome them. Vergel Santos is one of the lions of Philippine journalism. He has served as editor-in-chief of 2 national newspapers and publisher of a third. Joel Ariate Jr. is a university researcher at the University of the Philippines in Diliman, working at the Third World Studies Center. With colleagues, he is engaged in the Marcos Regime Research Project. Good evening, Vergel, and good evening, Joel. Thank you for joining us today in the public square.
Hi. Hi, John. Hi,
Good
Joel.
evening. Vergel, my first question is to you. Was the rise of Marcos inevitable?
Certainly it was if we didn't vote for him. But whether it was inevitable or not is I think a question that by now has become pointless since he's there. But whether I think the more important point is that he could have been stopped, but we didn't even try. So that now we have a second Marcos coming. But definitely, when the Marcoses returned just over 5 years after they had been kicked out into exile, to some extent they were welcomed. In some high places, they were even embraced. And in a few, I observed them being ostracized in some places. But in any case, all in all, it seemed to me that there was not a general disapproval of their return, and certainly the ruling power at the time. Well, the excuse could be made that the president at the time was very busy trying to fend off plots here and there. Remember, Mrs. Aquino had to deal with 9 plots, 7 of them mounted. So I don't know whether that could be excused at all. I don't know. It's not for me to say. But in any case, those seem to me the situation that favored the Marcos' second coming.
What about the first coming of the Marcoses? In 1965, was it inevitable for Marcos to become president? In 1972, was it inevitable for him to declare martial rule?
Marcos was favored by the times. Marcos was favored by the operating culture of the times. Please
Mm-hmm.
understand that I don't know whether we had any operating culture, political culture, other than patronage.
Mm-hmm.
And Marcos understood that very well. And but another important thing was that the Philippines was a favorite client of the Americans at the time.
Mm-hmm.
That was 1972, and the Vietnam War was raging, and Subic and Clark were definitely strategic to the war. And therefore,
Mm-hmm.
Marcos could easily have made a bargain with his patrons, and so that his patrons could not have at all um objected to him installing himself as a dictator. Other
Mm-hmm.
places in South America had the same experience. Yeah, those were the two things to me that
Mm-hmm.
favored Marcos's self installation as a dictator.
Can I just locate your experience? Where were you in 1972 when martial rule was imposed?
I had just completed my 6th year on the Manila Chronicle,
Mm-hmm.
one of the four major daily newspapers at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Before that, I had worked for Teddy Benigno at Agence France Presse. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, I continued working for Teddy as well on the side as I was working as a mainly copy editor and revise man at the Manila Chronicle. Um, Understand that I was very young at the time. I started as a newspaperman when I was 17 years old, so that when I joined the Chronicle, I had only turned 20, and I always deferred, not having been schooled enough. Although I thought I thought I might be able to get by without as much schooling as other people thought. Uh, I realized I deferred to my elders and mentors. I listened to them. I asked them questions, and it seemed to me that at the time, um, nobody even believed that Marcos would declare martial law. If you will remember, on the night of martial law, Senator Benigno Aquino himself had just spoken to an audience and
That's right.
said exactly the same thing. And also, before that, Senator Pepe Diokno with the patriotic, the patriot publisher Chino Roses, but at
Mm-hmm.
the Press Foundation of Asia, and the famous quotation of Pepe was uttered there. Uh, Marcos may be able to build a throne of bayonets, but can he sit on it? You know, so nobody believed that. And even
Mm-hmm.
after Marcos had dropped, as I remember, had dropped the exact phrase martial law, you know,
Mm-hmm.
probably twice before he um, he really made a go of it. So nobody believed. Nobody believed. I think we were. I think we had our own illusion about democracy and freedom and all those things that we didn't think anything like that could happen to us.
We'll have time, I hope, to talk about how Marcos made full use of those illusions, those delusions. But Joel, I'd like to
Yeah.
bring you aboard. Tell us a little something first about the Marcos regime research project that you're involved in.
Okay. Since 2013, so it's almost a decade now, the
Mm-hmm.
Third World Study Center, I've been working on doing further research or coming up with new perspectives, new understanding on how Marcos was able to craft the regime, the dictatorship that he presided and his family over. And the immediate event that triggered that particular concern on the part of the Third World Study Center
Mhm.
was when certain parties within the university proposed that the then College of Business Administration be renamed as it is now as the Verata School of Business.
Mhm.
We thought it's rather way beyond the purview of honoring a certain person at the same time discarding the heritage, the activist heritage of the university. So we started a series of forum actually, uh, asking people to look back and provide new understanding or new data regarding the dictatorship. And this was also uh, actually being undertaken when the center was also doing a technocracy, an oral history of the
Mhm.
Marcos technocrats.
Mhm.
So we're in the best position to reassess that particular period. And later on, when the PCGG files were digitized through the National Historical Commission of the Philippines,
Mhm.
and we were also given a chance to have access to the material and produce publications from it. So we were able to develop a special issue of our journal, Kasarinlan, and the special issue was entitled Marcos Pa Rin, meaning that we're still problematizing the regime, and there's an emergence actually of strong support for Marcos. So we have, I think, one of the earliest discussions on how the Marcoses then were positioning in social media.
Did the
So
issue of Kasanilan come out in 2013 or 2014?
it was a bit later. I think we finished preparing the issue around 2015, actually. Uh,
You,
so,
Mhm.
but it was based on a series of forum that we
Okay.
did
Yeah.
in 2013, 2014. Yes.
Joel, so I wanted to locate also your experience. I mean, you belong to a much younger generation. Uh, but you've done research on Marcos manipulation of information that goes all the way back to, I think, the 1930s. I wanted to ask you, is there a difference between the Marcos uh, before the declaration of martial law and the Marcos after when it comes to
Actually,
information or
we were just reviewing the initial draft of the articles that we're putting together as a book that we're calling Marcos Lies. And
Mhm.
in one of the articles that we've written, uh, there was the discussion of what happened in the Nalundasan case.
Mhm.
But the angle of our article was that a review of that case could have prevented actually the burial of Ferdinand Marcos, because the rules state that if that person being buried is involved in a case involving moral turpitude, then it will disqualify that person from gaining ground in the libingan ng mga bayani. And to go back to that particular issue, why is there moral turpitude case? Because there was a contempt of court conviction for Marcos
That's right.
uh, inherent in that case. And what they were doing was that even before the testimony of the main witness against them could be heard by the court and ruled upon, the Marcoses ganged up and filed 8 separate complaints that would have merited, if the complaints were entertained and ruled on, uh, would have merited 20 years of jail for the
Mhm.
witness in that Nalundasan case. So that's rather indicative of how Marcos would deal with inconvenient truths that would imperil their particular political project. That he will not hesitate to use the full extent of the law to, well, as we usually discuss, tell it now to weaponize the law. And that's exactly what Marcos Sr. was doing way back in 1938. And after, of course, the declaration of martial law, there's no opposition to that. Another concrete example would be the case of the We Forum, when it started a series of Bonifacio Hiliego's article exposing the spurious war records of Marcos. They ended up shutting and jailing the people connected with We Forum. So that's the authoritarian fascistic streak, I guess, on the part of Marcos Sr.
Vergel, I'm curious. The Nalundasan story, was that part of the Marcos
Yeah.
narrative or anti-narrative when he was running for
Uh,
president?
yun, it was to an extent, But you
Mhm.
see, it seemed to me that even at the time, uh, Marcos was running um favored by friendly institutional sectors. Um,
Mhm.
in fact, everyone continues to ask whether um, did he acquit himself on his own lawyerly brilliance, or
Mhm.
did he appear before a court predisposed to acquit him? Remember that the chief justice at the time was was Laurel, and also I don't know what could have been at the time revealed uh, as even as peripheral um, proofs or evidence about the Marcos character, because I
Mhm.
imagine that if you have a case like that, that would be
Mhm.
allowed, that would have been allowed in court. But you were just talking, Joel was just about talking about business ad building. I mean, that's how neighborhoods in this country go. That's how
Mhm.
the Hero Cemetery went. They buried Marcos. That's how neighborhoods around roads and bridges named for the Marcoses. It's the
Mhm.
same. That's how neighborhoods go, and that by itself would give you an idea of how people either didn't understand or didn't care, or too probably too preoccupied with other things to even think of a Marcos coming to power again, or a Marcos declaring martial law, because the first few years of martial law was rather um, acceptable,
Mhm.
to a certain degree. I think about 2 or 3 years, it people seemed happy with martial law.
Mhm.
So uh, I imagine that it always has to do with culture and the times there. uh, Even now, people are debating a debate which I think really pointless, whether we are a repressed nation. You know, I don't know. I don't know why we even have to debate that. Repression is the story of our life. And this is, I think we are majority of the many of our people, in any case, are so inured to that kind of to repression, such that repression has become a way of governing. You know, in practically
Mhm.
every regime, repression is a way of governing. It's not only in Marcos's case, but across the regimes. I wonder if that's not the
Yeah.
case.
Yeah. I think that J.P. Laurel was an associate justice of the Supreme Court when he wrote the opinion
Associate
acquitting
Justice, yeah, at the time.
acquitting
He wrote the
Mark.
opinion. Yeah, that's right. Quitting.
That's right. For my money, I think he was and is the best writer among all the Supreme Court justices of the Philippines. But this idea of repression as a way of governance, are you saying in a way Marcos just took advantage of that culture or that way of governing and brought it to its extreme?
Yes, yes, and had uh, had had a good point to it. I mean, he put in a good point to it. The oligarchs, remember?
Mm-hmm.
The impression was given that the oligarchs were partners in the repression. Of course, repression covers everything: oppression,
Mm-hmm.
subjugation, everything of that sort.
Mm-hmm.
That they were partners in this repression, and that was the reason why most of the nation was wallowing in poverty. That was, of course, not the case. We were not. I don't know the poverty incidence at the time, but we were 40 million at the time, or 45, something like that. And didn't seem to me the times were so bad. I I wasn't. My family wasn't rich. My family was certainly not upper class. My family, but neither was my family poor. And in my own neighborhood, where supposedly people were poor, uh, poverty was not a was not a point of protest, even at the time. Poverty was not
Mm-hmm.
a point of protest. Poverty probably was most was sharpest in the countryside. In the countryside, I would imagine, because the
Mm-hmm.
countryside at the time was neglected. But if you look at the you look at poverty incidence numerically um, in proportion to the rest of the nation, I don't think it was that bad. Marcos simply wanted to run us all over. That's all he wanted, and he wanted to. It's a fascistic streak, and I think the plunder came later. Opportunity after opportunity after opportunity came, and
Mm-hmm.
so in the end, Marcos's regime was one of torture, murder, and plunder.
Joel, both Vergel and you have spoken of the authoritarian or fascist streak in Marcos's character. Can we also speak of a trait in Marcos that lent itself to lying, to manipulation of information? Maybe you
Uh,
have you can talk of specific examples.
Jokingly, palagi namin sinasabing kasalanan ng magulang yan. But if you really look at the biography of Ferdinand Marcos, uh, the father and the circumstances of the father's death of Mariano Marcos really weighed heavily on Marcos, on Ferdinand Marcos, that forced him to concoct various ways of lying in order to memorialize his father. And his mother, there are snippets of interviews of Marcos's mother
Doña Josefa.
telling Doña Josefa, telling these marvelous stories of genius and agility of
Mhm.
the young Marcos. Um, but all this, let me just go back to the case of Mariano Marcos. Mariano Marcos was considered as an agent, at the very least, of the Japanese forces, and thus was apparently executed by the Filipino guerrillas up north. And that really, that's one of the greatest lie that Ferdinand would manufacture. He'd put up a plaque saying, commemorating the great life of his father,
Mhm.
and naming the university as Mariano Marcos and so many other places uh, in honor of his father. And this particular fact really rankled on Marcos when it was brought about later on, in tandem with his spurious war records. So then you have this mother in the case of Doña Josefa, who's willing to be in a conspiracy with his own son in order to defraud the U.S. government in filing fictitious claims of
Mhm.
war damages that they and these were all proven by the U.S. Army and the U.S. government as really, as one of the evaluators have said, not only fraudulent but criminal. So the mother also presented herself then, Doña Josefa, as a leader of a guerrilla group of women, as much as Ferdinand Marcos was the head of the Maharlika. And the Maharlika, in fact, is basically a cabal of Marcos kings. So that particular point, actually, in the biography and psyche of Marcos, we can argue that uh, really drove him, as they have said, the lust for power is not rooted in strength but in weakness. And in Marcus's case, it's more in insecurity and shame that he had to achieve great things, things unequaled, to be able to clean the name of his father.
Um, I'm reminded. I don't want to reduce our history, our very rich history, to the story of two families. I'm reminded that Ninoy Aquino was also driven by a need to redeem his family name. Right, his father was a speaker of the assembly, I think,
Yeah.
during the Japanese Puppet Republic. And Marcos, of course, must have known that his father was
Or Philippine president.
drawn and quartered
Or our first
by.
Philippine president.
Yes. Joel, we can talk about the war medals, but there's something that even pops out, no? Even in that battleground known as Wikipedia, no?
Mhm.
In the Wikipedia article on Marcos, this pops out there. He had he had a previous marriage or a previous partnership,
Mhm.
Carmen Ortega, but very few people know about that now.
Teka.
Can you talk about that?
Okay, I think this now, in a way, links to the issue of was Marcos an inevitable leader, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak? Because I think Marcos was a very astute politician, but there was no certain degree of inevitability that he would end up as a dictator, as a president,
Mm-hmm.
as articulated by some writers and historians. The case that he Marcos was willing to uh, drop out to scuttle an existing relationship in favor of a one that will foster greater political alliance is all part of that calculation. And there's
Mm-hmm.
also that context now, for example, of uh, Arsenio Lacson dying. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
because Arsenio Lacson could be a strong contender within against Marcos in the 1965 election. And
Mm-hmm.
there were, of course, the contentious relationship between Macapagal and Marcos, and the effort to mediate within the Liberal Party on what Marcos could, the share of their effort to elect Macapagal and so on. But just to go back to the Carmen Ortega issue,
Mm-hmm.
I think it was part of the early calculations of consolidations of political power of Marcos, because the Ortegas of La Union, for example, were known, uh, they're a political family significantly influenced by them. So that's the initial alliance. But then
Mm-hmm.
Marcos saw that having an ally with the Romualdeses will much further his political fortune.
Mm-hmm.
So discard one family, have another one. And most of that now, of course, goes unremarked. We don't even know what happened to Carmen Ortega or to the children, to Marcos's children, like Carmen Ortega.
That's really fascinating stuff. Um, Vergel, may I ask you? This is related to the war medals, the alleged heroism of
Yeah.
Marcos during World War II. Uh, my impression was that it was only when he was already holding national office that he he was projecting himself as war hero. But in the early stages of his career,
Yes.
political career, he was just a guerrilla. Is that the right impression?
Yes.
Parang he sort of just embellished it, and it reached a point and he said he had 32 medals.
Well, that's Marcos for you. When he hit upon something, he goes on and can't seem to and couldn't seem to stop himself.
Mhm,
And also understand that right after the war, uh, collaborationism was in the beginning. It was a it was an issue, but soon enough, very soon enough, um, we were taken with the American lies
mhm,
themselves. You know, remember that Rojas himself was trade minister of the occupation government, and in fact
mhm,
he was on MacArthur's staff. And then when he was arrested, joined the occupation government as trade minister, and then
mhm,
MacArthur picked him again because he knew him and he would prefer someone he knew, and so he became so he was the shoe-in candidate for the president of the First Philippine Republic. Uh,
mhm,
Osmeña himself would have been a fairly, comparatively decent, a decent first president. But
mhm,
a number of people, I have seen reports showing that Osmeña himself felt unworthy to a certain extent of that kind of opposition because of letters from his sons admitting to to doing business with the occupation government, making a profit. So
mhm,
those were the times, and I think to look at what's happening today without looking at collaborationism and
mhm,
the American clientelism, you know,
mhm,
we wouldn't be able to put together a more reasonable picture of why we have come to where we are. Those I think were very important events in um, uh, informing our own perspective, our culture. And if you look at that, I mean, and Macapagal, I mean, we were talking about Macapagal. Uh,
mhm,
Macapagal and Marcos became a fight between Macapagal and the oligarchs backing Marcos. That was how it was. You know,
mhm,
that's why Macapagal didn't have a chance. But of course, again, we must understand that after Garcia, who instituted a Filipino First policy,
mhm,
Macapagal in pushed the American line of the control, meaning free
mhm,
market. So
mhm,
in that sense, he was the the American candidate at the time. But then after that, stepped in the uh, the elite, the economic elite of the country, and decided a Marcos presidency would be good for them. You know, so I think that was how it was, and I think our own culture, however confused it might be, could be uh, could be traced from all that. Could 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 be traced from all that.
Thank you. We're running long. My apologies. So maybe one or two last questions. Joel, I wanted to make sure that we had a chance to talk about this. You spoke earlier about you're putting together
I,
articles on the different Marcos lies, and you are planning to launch the book, at least the electronic version of the book. When and why that particular
okay.
day?
Actually, we're launching both a website dictadura.upd.edu.ph, and the book Marcos Lies, which a compilation of the articles that we put out for the
Mhm.
past several years. So there are actually 31 chapters or articles in the book, and it in a way chronicles the various lies concocted by Ferdinand Marcos from the 1930s during the Nalandasan trial up until the Marcos comes that we're experiencing almost every election cycle.
Mhm.
So those are the, in a way, a culmination of the decade-long effort to revisit the Marcos regime and also to take stock of where we are now of this particular restoration, so to speak.
And it's on September 23, which is the
Yes, on
actual
September
real date.
23. Yes, it's part of the events put together by the University of the Philippines in Diliman to
Mhm.
commemorate the 50th anniversary of the declaration of martial law.
And that's the exact date, September
I-
23.
as the public have learned about it, not the
Yeah,
21
that's
that
right.
Marcos
Yeah.
insists.
But how provocative to think that even as important national project as this, Marcos chose a mythical date because he had a penchant for the number seven and its multiples. Uh, Vergel, quick question, quick answer, please. Marcos, was it only Imelda who hijacked the cultural class, the cultural elite, or did Marcos also have a hand in the co-optation of the artists, the intellectuals?
I think Marcos had a hand in it. In fact, I think by the time when Marcos, after Marcos installed himself dictator, soon enough been able to attract all those guys, and
Mhm.
and to me that was really revealing, to be so quickly co-opted by an unabashed dictatorial regime, you know so you had of course Marcos was really able to attract the some of the uh, truly good operators of the time.
Mhm.
It's really so. I think there was a certain predisposition on the part of all manner of elites, whether it be the literary elite or the business elite or the cultural elite or whoever. I think there was a predisposition toward that, and I think martial law fairly was easy enough to sell to the rest of the nation because of that.
Thank you. And then, Joel, last question for you. Again, quick question,
Yeah.
quick answer. Can you say something about number 204 Ortega, the Marcos house in San Juan, which is
Yeah.
now like a monument to him?
Yes. I think as we've written in that particular article, um, this particular house is extract in a way it's a trial space for the Marcoses on how to accumulate wealth.
Mhm.
Just the circumstances on how it was purchased, for example, the cost of the house and lot, if I recall it correctly, was around 50,000 pesos during those times. But
Mhm.
what Marcos did was to borrow from three different individuals an amount thrice of that, and then
Mhm.
eventually would declare those loans as something that could be deduct as a liability
Mhm.
in his income tax. So that's Marcos for you. Always calculating on how he could, in a way, man up a particular situation, gain from it tremendously. And of course, that's also the place when Imelda started bragging to close associates and relatives that we have sackfuls of money. And then the exaggeration from sackfuls of money to gold embedded in the walls of the house. So this whole myth of them having this almost unexplained abundance was, of course, indicative of their predisposition for plunder.
Oh wow! We can go on and on. There's so much to talk about. We've run out of time.
Oh yeah.
To Vergel Santos
Yeah.
and Joel Ariate Jr., thank you for sharing your time, your experience, and your insights. Your work in journalism and in the university helped
Been a pleasure.
define and defend the public
Maraming
sphere. Thank you.
salamat. Maraming salamat.
Salamat. Salamat.
From the diaries that Marcos kept, we can trace the evolution of his coup against the state. Let's do exactly that next week. But for tonight, that's it for us. The next step for engaged citizens is always to take a more active part in rebuilding our democracy. See you in the public square. This is John Nery. Thank you and good night.